And so when I dialed the number, the person on the other line simply said, Greene County Coroner. And when I heard those words, my first thought was, I've dialed the wrong number. And he said Hope. And when he said Hope, I was like, yeah, this is Hope. And he's like, I am so sorry to do this over the phone. And he said, Justin and his roommate, Justin was living in our hometown with two roommates, got into an altercation that turned into a physical bar fight, if you will, where they were throwing punches. And then one of the roommates pulled a gun, put it to Justin's chest, and shot and killed him.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Flip That Shit. I am your host, Stacey Urich, and my guest today is going to be Hope Reger. Before we get started, I just want to remind you a little bit about what Flip That Shit's all about. This podcast is all about meeting with people randomly, really. I've only met with Hope about 5 minutes prior to this, or maybe more like a half hour. But I didn't know her prior to that. And I'm constantly seeking out people who have a story to share that is something that brought them down to their knees and they kind of had the breakdown before they had the breakthrough. And the reason why I do this podcast is because we all have it. Every single one of us has been experiencing or have experienced some sort of, let's just call it a shit sandwich, like some sort of catastrophic experience. And the problem is I think growing up, and I was raised in the 70s and 80s, I think growing up, because it wasn't talked about that life is a series of experiences that are designed for us through challenge, that when we came up against challenge, we thought our life was wrong, or we thought it was bad, or we thought it was broken. But it's none of those things. Life is designed to be hurdles that you can overcome. So in life, you can learn the lessons that you're meant to learn and transform and evolve into the person you're meant to be and to give meaningful life and purpose to what you're doing. And I know you're going to get that today when we talk to Hope. So let me tell you a little bit about who Hope is. Hope lives in Ohio with her husband, Mike. And she has two sons, Brian, who's 33, and Justin, who is forever 19. She has three amazing granddaughters, Haylin, Addie, and Brielle. Did I say that right?
Briley,
I'm sorry. Hope's day job is she is a talent coordinator with a major financial institution for the past 26 years. But when we talk about that purpose and the pain and that meaningful life, Hope believes that her purpose in life was given to her after the traumatic loss of her son, Justin, to murder. That purpose is to provide positivity, inspiration, and hope to others through her Grief to Hope program that she created in honor of Justin. Grief to Hope is a virtual peer grief support group that allows other grievers a safe space to be their authentic self with support of others who understand and know exactly what they're going through. One of Hope's quotes that she likes to end each session with is, grief changes your entire world, but it can also inspire you to change the world. I just got a chill when I was saying that, Hope. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, my goodness. So obviously we want to talk a lot about Justin and that turning point in your life. But when I was going back and looking at the notes from our pre-podcast interview, you know, it was interesting because what you shared with me was life sucked. You know, you felt like life had been hard when you were younger. You know, your parents divorced when you were 8. You felt as though there had been a lot of traumatic experiences growing up. Beyond the divorce, there was constant moving. I think the kids kind of felt like maybe they were a burden to mom. You got pregnant as a teenager, kicked out. You got married and had a second child and then got divorced. And so life was hard. No one would deny that. But then your son was killed by shotgun. And that's when you realized nothing up to that point had been hard, correct?
Yeah, so the way that just to correct, my kids were, I never felt were a burden. I always felt as a
No,
child that I was a burden to my parents. And
correct. Yes.
so I've lived for my children, and being a mom was super, super important. But up until that point, until that day, November 17th, 2016, I always thought life was a series of unfortunate things that happen. Divorced parents, and then I was had a child at a very young age, and everybody told me I couldn't do it, and I was going to prove them wrong, and I was not going to be part of the system, and then I made choices in my life thinking I was bettering myself and opportunities, and those actually would be slammed in my face as that wasn't the best choice, Hope. And just not feeling that connection with my parents that most people have, I wanted to have with my own children. And so I lived for my kids and being a mom. And that was my number one priority in life, was to be the mom that I didn't receive, but I knew sort of that fantasy life that I wanted to give my kids. And so until that day, I thought that things would come and it would pile on, right? Like, we had a house fire, and then it was like the next year, my ex-husband at the time, or my husband at the time, he's now my ex-husband, he had 5 bypasses at age 27. He was in ICU, right? Who does that? How does that
God.
happen? So he almost died. We lost everything. We had built our home, and he was self-employed and I worked at a bank, and we had our own concrete business, and he fell ill at 27 years old and had to have 5 bypasses, and we lost everything. And I kept thinking to myself, okay, if I keep giving that positive attitude, things will, it won't be so bad. And that's the way I've gone through life is, okay, it happened. Let's think something positive and move forward. And always look at the cup half full kind of thing, even though I felt like there was always something coming, right? And with my children, I always felt like they were going to know that mom was going to be there. Mom's there no matter what. You can come and tell mom anything. I was always going to be, and this is sort of like I tell people all the time. I wanted to be their best friends. I wanted to be their everything. And looking back, of course, that wasn't the greatest idea, but the relationship that I built with my kids was something so incredibly important that I always made moves in my life to think that that was the right thing to do.
And so when you talk about all of the challenge that you had, did you just kind of feel like a black cloud like followed you? Did you have that attitude in your mind, even though you were trying to lead with positivity?
Well, absolutely. I mean, things happen to most people where they're like, I don't know how I would have done that, or and I would hear that and I'm like, okay, so bad things happen. But it seemed like for me, like I was constantly battling happiness. Like I was constantly looking for it, but I couldn't, like as soon as I had it, it'd be taken away. Right.
It's so interesting. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I've worked with a couple of clients that have been in similar situations. And the question I've often asked is, at what age did you decide that happiness wasn't available to you?
Oh, I don't think I ever felt that way. I searched for it. I'm still, I'm at a level in my life, or I'm at a place in my life now that it's great. And I found happiness, and it took a very, very traumatic, overwhelming depths of hell to figure out what that meant for me, what happiness means. And so I think we as people, we're always searching for that fantasy, Joan Cleaver, nothing's ever happens, the car never breaks down, the groceries are always paid for, you never have to fight for anything kind of life, where if we just stop and realize the things that we are involved in and the things that do happen to us are just sort of what I've heard you say is experiences to put you where you are today.
And I think that is the biggest misnomer. We we were raised on Disney and after school specials and Schoolhouse Rock, and nobody was ever talking that life was going to be hard.
Right.
And our parents were not telling us life was going to be hard. Obviously, they had hardship. Obviously, all of the generations above us had hardship. But I know in my household, it really wasn't a conversation. And so when life got hard, it felt wrong.
Right.
Or broken, or, you almost had this thought process that everybody else's life is great and I'm the only one. It's just me, because no one's talking about their dirty laundry, right?
Absolutely.
No one's talking about the shit, which is part of the reason why I do this podcast, is because that still is pervasive today. And what I know is that lends to secrecy, that lends to people hiding in the shadows their true authentic life, thinking theirs is different from everybody else's when it's not. We're all walking with shit. And so hopefully at least one person will listen today and say, wow, that story is so similar to mine. Let me step out of the shadow just a little bit and connect with someone on this. So given that, do you want to talk about what that worst low point was for you?
Absolutely. And I agree with you 100 million %, because I think one of the things, before I get to the story of Justin, is one of the things that I've learned over the years is toxicity with your family. It was almost like taboo if you stopped relationships with someone in your family. It was like not blood's thicker than water kind of thing. And that was one of the things that is I think is finally getting to a point where it's acceptable. Like, I don't have, the mother-daughter relationship that was, glorified, but absolutely. So in doing so, I completely agree with you. So in November 17th, 2016, I received a knock at the door. And it was just like the movies. You look out and there's police. And I literally was living in a condo at the time. And I looked down and my bedroom apartment, and I saw two cops standing there waving me down. And so I opened the door, and the first thing that goes through my mind is not something horrific has happened, ironically enough. I'm thinking, my son, I had two sons at the time. One was already, my oldest one he had his family, his house, he was living his life. And then I had my 19-year-old son who was fearless, right? Who tried anything once. And so my thought went to, oh no, what has Justin gotten into and can't get a hold of me? That's my first impression, right? Not that it would be something horrific. And so the worst situation that could have possibly happened at that moment was they handed me a piece of paper. First, they asked who I was and if I was Justin's mother, and I, of course, said yes. And that, again, affirmed, like, oh, what did he do kind of thing, not horrific. And so then I was like, okay, what's this about? And they're like, there's a name and number on this piece of paper, and they're like, you need to get a hold of them. They're trying to get in touch with you. And this is 6:30 in the morning. And I'm thinking, again, okay, Justin's got himself in trouble, whatever. And so I was like, do you know what this is about? And they said, no, not aware, don't know, just call that number. So I was like, okay. And so I again thanked him, shut the door, and walked upstairs thinking nobody's going to answer the phone at 6:30 in the morning. But just in case, maybe he's in jail or something and he doesn't have his cell phone. And of course, we can't remember phone numbers. And so I literally sat on the bed, and my husband said, what was that about? And I was like, something about Justin. And he went in, got in the shower, and I said, I'm going to call just in case, because they acted like it was urgent. And I didn't want to wait till like 8 or 9 o'clock. And so when I dialed the number, the person on the other line simply said, Greene County Coroner. And when I heard those words, my first thought was, I've dialed the wrong number. Like, Greene County was our hometown, our home county, but then I thought maybe the government office, I got, maybe the coroner's answer in the jail. I mean, literally, I'm running through my mind, and I was like, I think I have the wrong number. And he said, Hope. And when he said Hope, I was like, yeah, this is Hope. And he's like, I am so sorry to do this over the phone. And again, I'm like, what are you going to tell me, right? And he said, Justin and his roommate, Justin was living in our hometown with two roommates, got into an altercation that started as like a verbal argument. I don't even know to this day what was it about, but arguing verbally, exchanging bad, words to each other that turned into a physical bar fight, if you will, where they were throwing punches. And then one of the roommates pulled a gun, put it to Justin's chest, and shot and killed him. Now, Justin didn't have a weapon of any kind on him. It was a physical fight that ended up being a tragedy. And he literally, this was at 1:30 in the morning. I'm talking to the coroner at 6:30 in the morning. So as you heard from me earlier, my kids are my life. And all I kept on thinking was, I need to get to him, right? And I kept saying, where is he at? And I'm thinking as a mother, I can fix this, right? I can fix this. Whatever this is, I can fix. And he said, Hope, I'm so sorry. And he's gone. And I kept saying, where's he at? Because I don't know if I couldn't, and I'm sure it's because of the shock and that incredible, overwhelmed, like you don't know what is being said. And he said he's at the morgue and you can't see him yet while they're pending the investigation, but you'll need to get in touch with the funeral home and go through that process. And he said, I'll meet you back at your hometown, because we're about 2 hours away. And I hung up the phone and I thought to myself, this just isn't, this isn't for real. And my husband comes out at the time and he was like, what was that about? And I said, Justin's gone. He's like, gone where? And I said, he was murdered in his apartment or in his house. He's like, whoa, wait a minute. I said, I don't know. And so then you turn into mom mode and you start like, okay, I got to call this person, because I wasn't aware that this had made the news. So the news, so the news had been reported. We lived in a small town. The news had reported a murder. It was like the first one in years in this county. They didn't say Justin's name, of course, because they hadn't gotten in touch with me, but it was all like the street, the house, everything. And so I knew I had to make these calls before they announced who it was, because they had talked to me. And so in those 5 seconds, when he answered the phone, Greene County Coroner, my life completely changed from the person I was to the person I am today. And I call it version 2.0. It absolutely changed everything that I deal with and how I look at life. But the crazy thing about it is, in doing so, and we went through all the funeral and that horrific kind of time, but he was arrested for murder that night. And then the victim advocate was assigned to me and it was going to grand jury. He was released from the prison, bonded out. I don't know how that works. But on top of the trauma of murder of my son, I had to go through the criminal proceedings. And then in March or April, it finally went to a grand jury where I don't know if you know much about, the courts and I knew nothing. It went to grand jury and he pled self-defense and they allowed it and he was never indicted for his murder. So as a parent, I didn't protect him from being killed. Now I failed him as a mother from the justice system. So as you can imagine, facing all of that within the first few months of his death, it was incredibly overwhelming.
Okay, so let's sit with all of that for a second. Let's sit with that all for a second. I thought it was so interesting how you described that experience, because I wrote this down because it almost felt to me like you were almost having an outer body experience. It was almost as though you were like third party witnessing somebody else's challenge at the beginning, because your husband's like, what's going on? And you're like, he's gone. Like, were you in shock? Like, was there any emotion? Were you able to even comprehend, or were you completely cognitively confused at that point?
When it happened, I don't remember. The only tears I remember was after I called everyone, and it was literally like screams on the other line, the questions why, and I couldn't answer. I was sort of like in a robotic moment where I was like, okay, this, and I'm a planner by nature. So I'm like, okay, I got to get this list down. And then once I made all those calls, and I was like, I got to get home. And all I wanted to do was get to my son. And it was the craziest feeling. I felt like he was alone and cold. And I couldn't get that vision out of my mind. And so I got in the shower, and it was exactly like you would picture it as a mother, just crying hysterically. And it didn't stop. Like I couldn't get a hold of myself. But that all happened, several minutes, maybe a half an hour later after all of these calls, that it hit me, but it took a very long time to accept the reality. And go ahead.
Well, I was going to ask, how long did that take?
So the moment that I accepted it was, and this is I'm very transparent and it's gritty. So all of the funeral arrangements have been done. I finally got a hold of a funeral home and that was another thing. I was so in shock of how funerals, and I'd never been through any kind of traumatic event, never even planned a funeral, or like I attended funerals, but I never like had anything to do with planning. And all that surprise of, I had an organ donor call me because Justin was an organ donor. And, just like, the things that you go through, the pictures, the clothes, the songs, all this kind of thing is coming at you at a million, you got to get this and you got to get that. And so that was sort of the envelopment. And then it felt like a business transaction doing this funeral, almost to the point where, and I say this because I want people to know, when you're planning for a funeral, they are going to want you to it's like you're planning to purchase a vehicle. It is that business-like. Like there is no human kind of empathy whatsoever on some parts of funeral homes. And what I mean by that was they're like, we need $10,000 to get his body. Well, of course I had savings, 401k and all that, but I didn't know where I was going to get that in 4, 5, 6 hours. And so until I found a funeral home that listens. So one of my main things that I talk about with funeral is find one that is empathetic and is very conscious of your way that you feel, and it's less businesslike, but I get it. So after calling several funeral homes and finally getting a funeral home that says, Hope, we'll figure out the money, we'll go get him, and we'll call you and let you know. Because that was my biggest thing, is I was like, he's cold, he's alone in this morgue, and you picture that. And she felt that. She understood that. So the funeral home went and they called me and let me know Justin was there and for me to come in, and we sat down and we discussed everything. But the moment that everything came into I accepted it was when she asked me if I was ready to see Justin. And so as a mother, you just aren't prepared. I don't know if you're ever prepared for anything like that. But the last time I seen Justin, he was laughing. He was, his sense of humor, his spunkness, his, craziness. He always was like laughing, joking. And so I remember walking down this hallway and she says, he's behind this door and I'll let you go in. And if you need me, I'll be right outside. And this is the funeral director. And we agreed that I would go first before any family went with me because I had like a clan with me, right? And so I walked into this room, Stacy, and at the end of the hall, it felt like the longest room of my life. There was a hospital bed, and Justin was laying on there, no clothes, but he was covered with a sheet. And I remember walking up to him, and he had some beautiful hair, brown hair, and he was letting it grow. And I remember just touching his cheek, and it was so cold. And that's the moment that I realized that he was not there. He was gone. He was not this person that was laying in front of me, that he was, and hopefully, and I believe that he was in a better place, but this was not him. And so when touching him and I gave him a kiss, and just that coldness I felt rush through me, that was when I accepted that he was no longer here and that I had lost him in the physical sense.
Intense, Hope. Intense. And, I think we always hear about these stages of grief, but we don't really fully understand or accept what they are until we've had to be in them. So do you feel like you were in some sense of denial up to that point?
Absolutely. I think when I think of stages of grief, I think one of the things is we all go through many stages of many types, and some stages you won't go through and some you go through twice. And so I want people to know that it's individualized. It's as individual as a fingerprint, grief is. But absolutely, I did not accept or understand or comprehend what was happening. And for me, it was going through the motions. And I remember even thinking sarcastically when the lady, I had to go and buy Justin clothes for him. I remember the lady, cute little thing at Old Navy, said, "Do you want a receipt for this?" And I'm thinking, I'm not going to be returning this. But you know what I mean? That kind of mindset, you're just in that robotic mode. And it was hard, but I definitely think I was not comprehending it.
Yeah. I mean, I think, the word that keeps coming to my mind is like complete detachment from reality.
Absolutely.
Right? And this is the way that our brain protects us. One of the things I'm wondering is everybody deals with grief differently.
Mm-hmm.
You had another child. Mm-hmm. You had a husband. Mm-hmm. You had an ex-husband. Mm-hmm. You had family members. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it can get really edgy when people are not grieving the same way or at the same pace. And so can you share with us a little bit, and this is nothing you and I have discussed before, what did that look like for you? And was that challenging?
So one of the things that I uncovered with my grief is I put everybody before me. So I tried to protect everyone in a way that I didn't bring up Justin because it was right around the holidays. It was Thanksgiving. It was Christmas. I still went out and got Christmas presents for my grandkids.
Right.
I still wanted to take care of everybody. And my older son, I'll be honest, I didn't want life to change for anybody else. And so I protected that little circle of mine to say, okay, we're going to be happy-go-lucky all the time, and nobody has to feel grief, and I will just protect myself and do it on my own, right? So as long as I don't act grievy, I say that word, I don't act grievy, nobody else around me will act grievy.
It's fascinating. Right.
Right. And so it ended up being, his birthday was in February of that year, the following year. And I literally had a birthday party for him. And I was like hostess with the mostest. I was talking to everybody and I was trying to make sure everybody was comfortable and like laughing, and we were exchanging memories, and we were doing all these kind of things. And then at the end of the day, I was like, what the hell was that about? That was not what I should have been doing.
I have a lot of questions. My hand is getting a lot of work right now. So the first question I have is, was anybody in your family frustrated with that because it was denying them their own reality and their own grieving process?
I think that I feel like to this day that everybody sort of grieved in a private manner and nobody grieved in a group kind of setting. And if they did, it wasn't talked about. So it was almost like, hey, everybody, we're going to put this on the shelf. You grieve your way, you grieve your way, you grieve your way. And we're going to put this on a shelf. And when we're together, we're going to act like it didn't exist. Right?
Would you do it differently in retrospect?
Absolutely. So I think one of the main things that I've learned over the years and with my group is to talk about it and know that it exists and feel it and accept it and release it. Because I think almost what we do is we end up hiding it, storing it, and then it comes out later in different avenues, right? But also, But also, I think one of the things is we protect other people's feelings. And so it was almost like we were protecting each other from not being upset, that we would just ignore it and it would go away and nobody would have to ask me, how are you? Or, I'm so sorry.
Well, that's it. And, it's so interesting as you're talking about this. Different circumstance. My dad's wife lost her mom at age 96, natural causes.
Mm-hmm.
But she had been living with them, and they had to go through that process. And it was like a 4-month process with hospice. So it was really kind of prolonged and laid out. And that had happened in September of this past year. And every year we go to my dad's house a few weeks before Christmas, and that's when we celebrate Christmas with them. Mm-hmm. You would have never known, right, that anything had happened. And my dad and his wife are in their 70s. So, what was interesting was I'm looking around. You're not missing a blip. The only thing that's missing is her mom. Mm-hmm. No one's talking about it.
Correct.
Everything looks perfect. She's the ultimate host. The drinks are on ice. The food is great. Happy-go-lucky. After dinner, I can just see her tank is empty.
Yep.
And I sit with her at the end of the dining room table while everybody else is cleaning up. And I ask her how she is, and she bursts into tears. Mm-hmm. Later that night, we're all playing cards, which is like her thing.
Yes.
And she's normally really like the Martha Stewart of the world. So we're getting this card game together, and we decided to change up a rule and she got really upset and she left the table. Very unlike her.
Yes.
And I remember thinking to myself, this has nothing to do with the cards.
Correct.
Right?
Yes.
And the next day, and she went to bed, also very unusual. Like we could stay up till 3:00 in the morning playing cards. So I was like, okay. And the next morning I pulled her aside and I said, who have you spoken to?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Who are you getting help from? Because you're walking around pretending like this didn't happen.
Right.
It happened. And part of what I heard you saying with planning this party for Justin and then, you know, watching my dad's wife try to make this perfect Christmas was also trying to convince herself or yourself that we can just move on. And if we just, it's like fake it before you make it, right?
Absolutely.
Like I'm gonna pretend like everything's fine. I'm going to put on the face. This way everybody else feels more comfortable. I don't want anybody else to feel any pain. But to me, it is like the extreme example of what I'll call deprioritization, right? So deprioritization is when we do not put our needs first or allow ourselves to grieve. And we want to make sure everybody else is okay.
Yes.
It's like when my cousin told me that she had breast cancer and I burst into tears and she goes, I'll be fine. It's going to be fine. And then was calling everybody to find out how they were. Right. And we're all terrified. And it wasn't until a year and a half later when all the things were done, the chemo, the radiation, the mastectomy, all of it, when she calls me crying. She goes, I had cancer. I was like, here we go. Okay, she got through that. But, you know, everybody's process with change and fear and adjustment to new is different. And, you know, there's no right way or wrong way, right? Let's face it. But I see it so often when people are like, I'm just going to pretend, if I can just pretend hard enough that it didn't happen, maybe I'll feel less pain. But don't you just feel like you're kicking the can down the road? And that at some point you have to, the pain comes in such a wall of a wave that it's suffocating no matter when you have it.
It was absolutely two different worlds I was living in. And so when I was alone, I was grieving. It was heavy. It was dark. It was ugly. But when I was around others, I put on that grief mask and I was like, we're not going to talk about it. Or if it does come up, I'm good. You're good. Okay, we're good. Same thing with my son. You know, I was like, how are you doing, Brian? He said, I'm good, Mom. I'm fine. And then it got to be to the point where I was starting to understand, and I went to a counselor and I started going to grief groups and I started explaining to these groups that I thought there was something wrong with the way that I was grieving because I was still able to, function, but I wasn't like in bed 24/7. However, it took everything out of me to get out of bed, but I was still functioning. Right. And I thought as a mother, does that mean Justin thinks that I don't love him as much as, and then I started feeling that guilt. And so luckily enough, my work had, they had an EAP program, employee program that would actually, I got to go to a counselor and I got to start venting my feelings, talking about it. And, like you said, everything in my whole entire life came through this grief. But one of the greatest things was in March when I felt like I let my son down with the justice system and I was getting help and I was talking and all these crazy feelings got to be almost to the point where I literally said to myself, Hope, you have two choices right now. And those choices are, because these were the only obvious choices to me, was stay in this hate and anger when you're alone, right? This hate and anger and frustration and ugly, revengeful thinking, or start to put a positive note on what you want to do and celebrate Justin and honor him, so you can start to focus on you, on Justin, but also for your family to realize that it's going to be around for a long, long time. And we have to work through this. And so that's when I had to realize I had to get out of it, because I was angry as hell. When I was mad, when I was
I
home
wouldn't.
alone, I was angry. I was pissed off at God. I was mad at the person that took Justin's life. I was saying, I'm going to let him, he took Justin. He's not going to take Hope. And that's when I sort of flipped that shit, where I know, you're welcome. Every time I hear your thing, every time I hear that, I looked at myself in the mirror, and it was a lot. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of work to get to where I am today. But I'll tell you what, when I made that acceptance and that flip to start to focus on, okay, how am I going to make my life better? How am I going to honor my son? How am I going to make people realize and how to respond to grief in a way that it's not going away. It's not ever going away. And I will be living, with grief the rest of my life. Is, what am I going to do about it now, today? What is that like today? And I had to take control over my emotions and my life in a way that I never had to before.
So let's talk about what that is. It's a perfect segue into your book, your 7-week program, Grief to Hope. Tell us about how you put purpose to the pain.
I'd love that. So in doing so, I thought, okay, this is it. What am I going to do, Hope? And so I literally had to put a lot of thought into what was going on with me personally. One of the things I attended was a grief group. And this grief group was Christian based. And I was like, it was great. It was sort of the 70s, 80s kind of grief group with like Zig Ziglar kind of thing. And so I realized it wasn't really the Christian, that lifestyle, which it did teach me a lot. And I've learned a lot about Christianity and my education with God. But it was being around others who felt and understood what I was going through. That for me was gold. And I didn't know how to do it, right? And I thought, well, maybe I'll leave a grief share group, or maybe I'll lead, something like that. And then it was like, okay, well, maybe I'll write a book, or maybe I'll blog, or maybe I'll do this and that. And so I volunteered a lot. I just learned to be kind to myself, be kind to others. And I always had it in the back of my mind, what can I do? What can I do? And then when COVID hit in 2020, everybody's life sort of grieved in its own way, right? And I remember thinking and hearing all the horrific stories about people that were dropping their parents off or their spouse off at the hospital, and that was the last time they saw them, or FaceTiming as they're taking their final breath, and just all this kind of, and I was like, I couldn't imagine dealing with Justin's grief during COVID, that immediate phase of grief, and not being able to have a funeral or have that closure of that. And so I remember being, as we're all doing right now, Zoom every day. I thought, wait a minute, I can bring people together virtually, where leaving the house is not you don't have to leave the house. You can show up with your wine, your coffee, your beer, your whatever, in your pajamas, to take off that mask, be around other people, and walk through what you're going through, share your story. And then on top of that, support others that were going through the same thing, not the same maybe type of loss, but they were going through grief, even if it was 3 years or 13 years, it didn't matter. And just letting them be their authentic self in a room that was virtual was priceless. And it ended up being, it's a 7-week course that I offer for free. And we just meet for 1 hour a week for 7 weeks. The first week is an introduction. It's basically my story, what I told today, in a little more detail and my why behind it. And then I spell out the word grief in our next 2 to 6 sections, 2 to 6 week session. Grief is for gift of time. So we talk about how time heals, time doesn't heal. Why do people say that? How you feel rushed. And then R is for receive help. How do you ask for help? How do you accept help? Did anyone help? I is inspiration, which is the whole baseline of my program. Is you have to find that reason to get out of bed every morning. That inspiration has to drive you to look forward to the day, to get up, to rise, to focus on something that moves you forward in your steps. So we talk about inspiration, and then expectations is E. What do people expect from you? What do you expect from them? Sort of what we talked about today. What do people expect? And then F is feel everything, which is it's sort of turned into almost like a show and tell. They bring me pictures, they share stories, they share memories, they share, their favorite toppings on pizza. It is a really cool, I love this session. It's one of my favorites. But they get to say their name and talk about their loved ones, which is hard for a lot of them.
Wow.
And then the last session we do is to hope. And that was last night we had our final session of the series. And we'll start a new one in the summer. But it was basically, what's your next step? And for some, it was, I want to go through their stuff. For some, it was literally like, I just want to be able to talk about it. I just want to be able to go to the grave and actually walk up to the grave versus sitting in my car crying. And it really didn't matter, big or small. It was just getting them to know how to move forward and what their next step is. And so that is basically how Grief to Hope was born in 2020. We've had 8 sessions the past 2.5 years, and it's just been incredible.
And how many people are usually in one session?
It really varies. It depends on the season, right? So I may have 30 people. I may have 4 people. So the average usually is anywhere from 10 to 14. And it's what I love about it is it can be somebody that's, lost their loved one to suicide, that's lost their loved one to health, to COVID, to overdose. There's every single level and feeling of grief, whether it's 13, 30, 3 months, is there. And we all learn from each other. And it's powerful. It is powerful. I had a lady last night that said she had come to all 7 sessions and she never spoke. And I don't encourage anybody to I don't call on you because I feel like it's your time when it's your time. And she said last night, and it gave me chills, was she said, I've come to all 7 sessions and I've never said a word, but I'll be back to tell my story.
Oh, honey.
Right.
But here's the thing. It's like, as you're talking, I was like, we're so in alignment, because my whole purpose with the podcast is just to have people listen and have the courage to speak to just one person about their challenge.
Yes.
Right? So for her to say, I've been there, I've heard it, that's part of her process.
Yes.
But she's starting to get purpose in her pain because she's going to want to start to give back by starting to share. So what you're doing is really incredibly profound. And, I'm always very, very, very mindful when I use the term, there's a gift in every challenge, because I constantly am thinking of people who have lost their children that probably just want to bitch slap me and say F you. No. Right? Because there's never going to be a gift in that challenge. And I always like to reiterate to people, it's not the experience that's the gift.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody's saying, I'd rather have what I gained from it than my child.
Right.
Obviously. But when you can get to that point of acceptance, as you said, and reality,
Mm-hmm.
and knowing it can't be changed and accepting what is, the gift in this challenge is your ability to be able to help heal other people. It's not saying that you'd rather do that than have Justin.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
But if you have to experience something
Mm-hmm.
that is challenging,
Mm-hmm.
was there somebody that you met through that experience that you wouldn't have in your life otherwise? Is there something you learned about yourself in that experience that you wouldn't have been able to attain and see otherwise? Is there something you could bring to the world that you absolutely wouldn't have ever had the opportunity to do like this unless ... this extreme challenge came your way? So it's not lost on me what you've done. I want people to know how they can find it. There's a lot of ways they can find it. The first is your website,
Yes.
which is grief2hopesupport.com. And the 2 is just the number 2. So it's grief2hopesupport.com. That program is free.
Yes.
And it is a 7-week virtual grief program. You also have a book, Grief to Hope, which can be found on Amazon.
Yes.
And if you're on social media, you can follow Hope. So Hope is Hope Reger on Facebook. She also has her group, Grief to Hope, again with the number 2. Grief to Hope 2020 is that Facebook group. And also on Instagram, Grief to Hope 2020. Hope, this has been amazing. I really had chills pretty much throughout the entire experience. Your ability to share it with such grace, which I'm sure has been part of the process, was extraordinary. And, you know, really, this is such a hard topic. And you and I were talking about this before we went on air that, you know, sometimes there's a stigma based on how someone died, right? Was it an overdose? Was it a suicide? Was it a murder versus a natural cause or an illness? And it's just really my hope that at least one person who's challenged with their grief process hears this interview today and feels a piece of hope, that they'll be able to walk out of that dark shadow and be okay.
Yes.
Right? Because I think that's probably one of the most traumatic things that comes out of the experience is, have I also lost myself, which you talked about earlier.
Yes. Yes. It's a beautiful, it's a transition. And what I learned the most from all of this and what you say, the gift that I received was the gift of being present in the moment, the gift that I deserve to be happy, the gift that I can service others and help them and guide them in their grief journey. But at the end of the day, I get to say my son's name every single day and talk about him every single day. And that in itself is a beautiful gift.
I honestly have no words to that. That is really one of the most beautiful things I've ever heard. Because Lord knows, if we were talking about our children, how old would he be this year? 26?
He'd be 26, yes.
Yeah. They would be so annoyed with us if we were speaking their name every single day.
Absolutely. It's so funny that you say that because I say the same thing. I said, I'm going to arrive in heaven and Justin's they're going to be like, you go, Mom. Or like,
seriously?
Are you serious, Mom? Are you serious?
Seriously? Yeah. Yeah.
I love it.
Yeah. Oh, gosh. Well, thank you so much. It's been a really inspirational talk. I love the way that you learned how to flip that shit because that is some really hard shit to flip for sure. So thank you so much for being on our podcast today. Again, if you're interested in hearing more about Hope, you can go to grief2hopesupport.com. If you enjoyed this podcast, please go to where all of our podcasts can be found, whatever platform you use. The podcast is Flip That Shit. Subscribe, share it with other people, and let's spread the love and stop the stigma. Thanks, guys.